Have you ever sat at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, and felt that sinking feeling when someone in your family asks for something? Again, maybe it's a favor, maybe it's money, maybe it's your time, but the moment they ask, you feel torn. You want to say no. You feel it rising in your chest. But somehow, what comes out of your mouth is yes. And then, after they leave, after the call ends, you sit in silence and wonder, why did I agree to that? Again, it's not that you don't love them. You do with every fiber of your being. But lately, it feels like love comes wrapped in invisible strings. Strings that tug at your guilt. Strings that say, you're the parent. You should help. You owe it to them. But here's the quiet truth. Many people don't talk about after 60. Sometimes love gets twisted. Sometimes guilt wears the mask of affection. And sometimes, especially when you've always been the giver, people learn to pull on your heartstrings in just the right way until you forget that you're allowed to say no. Grace was 67 when she first noticed it happening. Her son Caleb had just gone through a tough patch of breakup. Some debt, a job loss. He needed a place to stay. Of course she welcomed him. That's what any mother would do, but weeks turned into months. He left dishes in the sink, borrowed money without asking, and promised to pay her back next week. She believed him, again and again. But what stayed with her more than the money was what he said one night, when she gently asked him to look for his own place. He laughed. Really, Mom, after everything I've been through, you're gonna throw me out now? Wow. And just like that, her voice disappeared. Because that sentence wasn't just about the situation. It was a dagger laced with guilt, and it worked. She stopped asking. She started shrinking. She told herself he needed time, that he was hurting, but deep down, she felt small in her own home. That's what guilt trips do. They don't shout. They whisper. They twist love into duty, and duty into silence. The first guilt trip that often shows up sounds something like, after everything I've done for you. And maybe it's not even said aloud. Maybe it's just the unspoken look, the heavy sigh, the implied debt, as if your love must be earned back, endlessly. But love, real love, is not a transaction. It's not something you pay back like a loan. You are not in debt to your children because you raised them. You are not in debt to your siblings because you once leaned on them. You do not owe anyone your peace. Helen was 72 when her sister Sophie started calling more frequently, not to chat, but to remind her of all the things she'd done for her years ago. Remember when I took care of Mom so you could move to the city? Remember how I covered you when you were struggling? The ask always followed. So now I just need a little help. Only you can do it. It was always a little, but it never ended. And every time Helen hesitated, Sophie would add, you know, you never really said thank you for what I did back then. Guilt. Soft, sharp, sticky. Helen began to feel like she had to keep saying yes, just to prove she wasn't ungrateful. But she wasn't ungrateful. She was just tired. And she had the right to be. Another guilt trip that wraps itself in love is this one. You're the only one I can count on. It sounds flattering. It sounds special. But really, it's pressure. Frank had 4 grown children, all capable, all working. But somehow, the responsibility of caregiving for the grandkids, organizing birthdays, even sorting out family disputes, it all landed on him. One day, he asked his daughter Chloe why she never called her brothers to help. She shrugged. Because you're the only one who actually shows up. That one sentence held 1,000 expectations, and wrapped beneath it, a quiet threat. If you don't do it, no one will. So if you say no, you're letting everyone down. Frank carried that weight until one day, his back literally gave out, lying in bed with doctor's orders to rest. He finally had no choice but to say no. And you know what happened? The others stepped in, not perfectly, not eagerly, but they did. Because he wasn't the only one who could. He was just the one who always had. Sometimes, we forget that the more we do, the more invisible our needs become. People stop asking if we're okay. They assume we'll manage, and when we don't, they make us feel guilty for changing the rules, even if those rules were quietly crushing us. So let me ask you something gently. When was the last time you said no and meant it? When was the last time you didn't follow it with a long explanation? Or an apology, or a makeup favor, and how did it feel? in your body, in your heart, to finally hold that no like something sacred, because that's what it is. Saying no isn't selfish. It's a boundary. It's a full sentence. It's a way of saying, I respect myself enough to pause, to rest, to not be everything for everyone. You've spent decades showing up for others. Now, you get to show up for you. You get to decline without guilt. You get to change your mind. You get to honor your own energy without being made to feel like a villain. And the beautiful thing is, when you start saying no from a place of quiet self-respect, the world doesn't fall apart. The people who truly love you won't leave, and the ones who get angry, their anger is just proof that your yes was serving them more than it was serving you. That's not love. That's convenience. And you, dear heart, were never meant to be convenient. You, dear heart, were never meant to be convenient. That's something Helen said to herself one evening while folding laundry that wasn't hers. Her niece had dropped off her kids for the weekend again, and she'd agreed, again, because she couldn't bring herself to disappoint anyone. But there she was, tired, alone, folding tiny socks, realizing something heartbreaking. She wasn't even asked if it was a good time. They had just assumed. It wasn't cruelty, it was habit. And that's what guilt trips often become, habits. Not always malicious, not even always conscious, but patterns that silently tell you, if you don't say yes, you're unkind. If you set a boundary, you're ungrateful. If you step back, you're selfish. That brings us to another painful form guilt can take. You're lucky we still include you. It often sounds playful, a joke, a comment made in passing. But Grace remembered it clearly. It was during Christmas dinner. Her daughter-in-law, who never liked how she arranged the holiday table, had taken over the decorations and food that year. Grace had offered to help, and her daughter-in-law smiled and said, "It's okay, Grace. You just sit and enjoy. You're lucky we still let you be the head of the table." Upright. There were laughs, but Grace didn't laugh. She just sat there, feeling smaller than she had in years, because that joke held a message. We don't really need you anymore. And if you don't stay agreeable, you might not be welcome at all. That kind of guilt seeps in slowly. It makes you question yourself. Should I speak up? Should I just be grateful? Should I let it go? And over time, you start doing what so many do after 60. You shrink yourself just to stay included. You stop offering opinions. You let others talk over you. You become agreeable to the point of erasure. But here's the truth that must be spoken gently, yet clearly. Being included should never require your silence. You can be part of a family, part of a community, and still hold your ground. You can show up with kindness and still keep your dignity. You are not here to earn your seat at the table by saying yes to everything. Jack, a gentle man with a quiet laugh, had always been the family peacemaker, the one everyone called when there was conflict, the one who smoothed things over. But one day, after months of playing mediator between his adult children, he realized he was being pulled in every direction and blamed by all sides. And when he finally said, "I love you all, but I'm stepping out of this," his oldest son snapped, "Fine, just abandon us." Abandon. That word haunted Jack for days. He'd always believed that staying involved even at the cost of his own peace was proof of love. But he also knew he hadn't abandoned anyone. He had simply chosen to stop absorbing everyone else's chaos. Sometimes, guilt says, if you don't fix this, you're letting us fall apart. But you are not responsible for everyone's happiness. Not anymore. Not ever. Really. And that brings us to the most silent and heavy guilt of all, the one that says, if you don't help now, who will? It sounds noble. It plays on your compassion. It makes you feel like the last thread holding everything together. Frank felt this deeply. His wife had passed, and he had taken on the role of both father and grandfather. He loved his grandkids fiercely, but their needs began to fill every moment of his week. School drop-offs, errands, homework, help. He didn't mind doing it, but no one ever asked if he could. They simply expected it, and when he once said he needed a break, his daughter's face crumbled. "Dad, I don't know how I'm going to do this without you." That sentence, so heavy, so emotionally charged, became a leash. He took a deep breath. He looked at her with love, not anger, and said, "Sweetheart, I know you're overwhelmed, but I can't carry all of this anymore. It's not good for either of us." And in that moment, something shifted. She cried. He cried. But for the first time, they saw each other not as roles, parent and child, but as two people, each with limits, each deserving of rest. That's the miracle of graceful boundaries. They don't destroy connection. They invite honesty. They say, "I love you, but I'm human too." And that's where everything begins to change. Because guilt loses its power when it meets truth. When you stand in your clarity calmly, firmly, without apology, the world begins to adjust. Not always right away, not always without resistance, but it does. Emily, who had always relied on her mother Grace for childcare, began making new arrangements. Not because Grace stopped loving her, but because Grace started respecting herself enough to say, "Not this weekend." Sophie, Helen's sister, eventually stopped mentioning old favors. She either helped with love or not at all. But Helen no longer paid for connection with exhaustion. Frank's grandchildren started helping with small things around the house. They saw their grandfather not just as a helper, but as someone they loved, someone who had given them so much and who now deserved rest, joy, and dignity. And what about you? What would it look like if you began, even gently, to loosen the hold of guilt? What would shift if your no was no longer followed by shame, but by a quiet knowing? Because guilt trips may come dressed in familiar voices, but that doesn't make them right. You are allowed to say, "I've done enough." You are allowed to choose rest over resentment. And you are allowed always to love without losing yourself. And you are allowed always to love without losing yourself. It's such a quiet kind of strength, isn't it? To say no without raising your voice. To hold your boundary without holding resentment. To choose your own peace not out of spite, but out of self-respect. Because the truth is, something sacred happens when you stop trying to prove that you're good enough by saying yes to everything. You begin to reclaim parts of yourself you didn't even realize you'd given away. Margaret always described it as coming home to herself. For years, she'd been the family rock, the dependable one, the go-to, the fixer. She was proud of it, in a way, but also tired, quietly tired, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't go away with sleep. Because it's not about your body, it's about your soul. She used to think that if she stopped saying yes, if she stepped back, her family would stop loving her, that they'd call less, visit less, need her less. But when she finally said it, simply, kindly, "I need some time for me now," something unexpected happened. They respected it, not all at once. There were confused looks, some guilt, a few awkward silences. But over time, the people who truly cared about her didn't disappear. They adapted. They began to ask instead of assume. They began to check in with her, not just to ask for something, but to see how she was doing. And Margaret, she began painting again, reading again, sitting by the window with her tea, watching the light shift across the trees, not feeling like she had to be anywhere else but there. Because when you stop chasing approval, you begin to live in alignment. Not for them, for you. That's when things really start to change. Not in the people around you, but in how they respond to your presence. They don't feel something's been taken from them. They feel something has returned in you. You don't need to prove your value. You don't need to overextend yourself to be loved. You don't need to make yourself small so that others feel comfortable. In fact, when you stop doing those things, when you choose your dignity over your guilt, the people who truly love you won't punish you for it. They'll feel it, and they'll rise with you. Ethan noticed it in the way his daughter Chloe started calling just to talk. Not to unload, not to ask for errands, but simply to connect. It wasn't because he confronted her. It wasn't because he gave an ultimatum. It was because he changed the energy. He stopped answering her calls when he was too tired. He stopped offering before she asked. He didn't pull away in anger. He simply allowed himself to matter. And Chloe, she noticed the difference. At first, she was startled. "Are you okay, Dad?" she asked one day. He smiled and said, "I'm more than okay. I'm just finally taking care of myself." It was that simple, that profound. When you carry yourself with quiet grace, people start to listen differently. When you no longer allow guilt to steer your ship, your direction becomes your own. You begin to embody respect instead of begging for it. That's the shift. It's not about becoming hard or cold. It's not about shutting everyone out. It's about soft, steady power, the kind that says, I can love you and still choose what's best for me. You may lose a few people along the way, not literally, but emotionally. People who were more attached to your compliance than your well-being may resist the change. They may push back. They may sulk. Let them. You cannot keep contorting yourself to fit the story they've written about who you're supposed to be. You've earned the right to write your own, and in doing so, you'll find a surprising thing happens. Joy comes back, not the kind of joy that's loud or flashy, but the deep, steady kind. The kind that fills your lungs when you wake up and realize you don't have to explain yourself to anyone today. The kind that moves through you when you say, I won't be able to do that, and then you rest. Without guilt, Frank told me the moment he knew something had shifted inside him. His daughter had called, needing help with a last-minute move. Before, he would have dropped everything, canceled appointments, rearranged his world. But this time, he paused. He looked at his calendar. He took a deep breath, and he said, I love you, but I won't be able to help that day. There was silence, then a sigh. Then, okay, Dad, I'll figure it out. And that was it. No argument, no punishment, just space, respect. The beginning of a new dynamic, one built on choice, not obligation. That's how you begin to restore yourself, one boundary at a time, one choice at a time, one quiet, honest no at a time. You don't have to explain your peace. You only have to live it. And as you do, you'll notice your days feel different, lighter, more yours. You'll notice that the people who love you for who you are, not what you give, begin to draw closer. And those who relied on guilt, they may fall away, or they may learn to love you better. Either way, you'll be okay, more than okay. You'll be standing in the truth of who you are, strong, gentle, whole. You don't need to be loud to be heard. You only need to stand firmly in your light. That light, it's been there all along, waiting for you to stop dimming it for others, waiting for you to remember. You do not owe anyone your exhaustion. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to be seen. You are allowed to be free. You are allowed to be free. And if you've stayed with me this far, through every word, every pause, every quiet truth, I want to thank you, sincerely, because I know what it takes to sit with these feelings. I know how heavy guilt can be, how deeply it roots itself, especially in those of us who were raised to believe that love means sacrifice, that kindness means never turning anyone away, that being a good parent, grandparent, sibling, friend, means being endlessly available. But you're here, and that means something has already begun to shift. A part of you may be long buried, maybe just waking up is ready to breathe again, to draw a boundary, to reclaim your space, to learn, perhaps for the first time, that you don't have to carry everyone's expectations on your back just to be loved. If this video spoke to you, if it reminded you of your own story, or opened your heart in some way, I would be honored to hear from you. Has your relationship with your adult children changed over time? Have you ever struggled with guilt or felt like you couldn't say no without paying a price? What helped you heal? What are you still learning? You don't have to share it all, but if you feel safe, I invite you to leave a comment, not just for me, but for the others who might be reading, because there is something deeply healing in realizing that we are not alone in our experiences. Sometimes, seeing our own story reflected in someone else's words is enough to remind us that we're not broken, just human. And if this message made you feel seen, even a little, I hope you'll consider staying connected. Click subscribe if you'd like to walk this path together, not just through content, but through community, through quiet wisdom, through these little moments of truth that remind us it's never too late to come home to ourselves. And if someone in your life, a friend, a neighbor, someone you care about is struggling with boundaries or carrying guilt they were never meant to hold, I hope you'll share this video with them, not to change them, not to fix anything, just to say, I thought of you, and you're not alone, because that's really what this is about. Not being alone anymore, not feeling like the only one who has ever been made to feel guilty for needing rest, or for choosing self-respect, or for saying no. You deserve relationships that don't require self-erasure, You deserve peace that doesn't come with apology. And you deserve, always, to live the life that is true to you, even if that means disappointing others along the way. Their disappointment is not your burden. Their discomfort is not your shame. And your voice, your beautiful, gentle, powerful voice, is not too much. It's not selfish. It's not unkind. It's a signal to the world and to yourself that you are here, that you matter, that you will no longer trade your well-being for a moment of fleeting approval. You have given enough, loved enough, carried enough. Now it's time to rest in your enoughness, fully, completely, without guilt. Thank you for walking this path with me. Until next time, be kind to your heart. Say yes only when it's real. Say no without fear. And never, ever let guilt take the wheel again.